I have the honor and the privilege of saying something about this question first, and I'm also very excited to hear what your questions are about what we discussed in the moderated panel part of this discussion. And I want to say thanks for the invitation to speak at the forum, to all the sponsors, and to Professor Floyd and Dr. Burton for engaging with me. So I'll be blunt. I'm going to answer the question that's on the flyer: should some books not be read? And my answer is yes. The way that I understand that is that I think we are better off as individuals not reading some books, and more broadly, not encountering or engaging deeply with some instances of narrative art. So I'm going to include in there film and television, which we consume plenty of. I am quite aware that this is an unpopular view, and it has quite a notorious history, and I want to clarify what I think by engaging with that history to some extent. And my starting point for that is going to be Plato, who is the great enemy in the history of philosophy of narrative art. Part of the reason I want to use Plato is that many of you in the audience will be familiar with the Republic as part of Columbia's core curriculum or as part of other such curricula. I think that Plato was right to be suspicious of narrative art on specifically ethical grounds. But I also think that he gets this diagnosis a bit wrong, and that his political solutions are unacceptable. I'm not going to be advocating totalitarian suppression of art here. So what I want to do is I want to say some things about what I think Plato gets right, which is to say what's the view of Socrates in the Republic, and mention some points of common ground between me and that view in sort of increasing order of controversy, and then say what I think Plato gets wrong, and sort of use that as a starting point. So one thing that I quite firmly believe is that the ethical and the aesthetic evaluations of narrative art are inseparable from one another. So sometimes we talk about what makes for a good book or a bad book, and we might be speaking of its moral qualities or its ethical qualities. What sort of person does it make us? What sort of ideals does it embody? And about its beauty or its fittingness in a certain genre of literature. The latter are aesthetic evaluations. And I think we make a mistake if we try to divide these two firmly from each other. Moreover, and more controversially, I also think that when we're trying to decide the question of what makes for a good book or a good film, the ethical evaluation is actually primary in some sense. And that's because we have examples of narrative art that are good just for their ethical content, and they tend not to be the kinds of things that we think about first. So if you think about fables and other kinds of moral tales, parables, for instance, those can be good just because of their ethical content, even if they're not especially sophisticated. But I think it is impossible, and this is where I take the more controversial position. I think it's impossible for a book to be good if it is morally corrupting. Finally, I think, along with Plato, that there is an important place in social life for discussing what kinds of narrative art we should promote and what we should discourage. So I think this is not just an individual question, but a social question. And that too is controversial, of course. You might think that, there is this morally corrupting potential, but that's for individuals to decide. And I think we should talk about these questions together. So I think where Plato makes a mistake is that he thinks of our engagement with narrative art too simply as a matter of imitating what we find therein and absorbing certain kinds of values and then reproducing those values in our action. I'm not saying this is the only thing he thinks, but this is the basis of Socrates' critique in the Republic. And I think that one way in which this goes wrong is that it draws our attention to the idea that there's certain ethical facts and that literature can acquaint us with them. So for instance, heroic literature acquaints us with the idea that courage is a valuable part of human life. And, readers of the Iliad in Plato's Greek context might have been able to absorb that value. And Plato thinks that, because Achilles is a really whiny character, actually what people learn from reading Homer is that it's okay to be whiny, even when life is unfair. And so the ethical facts are wrong in Homer, and so we should reject Homer. That's a very crude picture of the argument of the Republic, but I think it's not so inaccurate. I'm interested instead in thinking about this question through the lens of a different set of our capacities, not our capacity for learning ethical facts, but our capacities for what I think of as the moral imagination. And I think this is where literature affects us most profoundly. So these capacities include our ability to imagine possibilities for action, but also imagining different structures for social life in the very way that Plato does in the Republic. Also, more personally or individually, the different contours or configurations that our personal relationships can have, the range of possibility of expressing our emotions and understanding the emotions of others, and our very general ability to reflect on ourselves and our position as human beings. And I think the moral imagination in that very capacious sense is really what's important. And that's not going to be a matter of merely imitating and then reproducing certain kinds of values that we learn or absorb from literature, wittingly or unwittingly. I want to be clear about this. I think Plato, like many censorious people, thinks of this problem as primarily a political one. So we have a group of people in the political community who decide, which books or which dramas are good, and based on their content and what supports the right kind of political project we should have. And I think we should think about ideals in the way that Plato thinks we should, but not think about that primarily as thinking of there's a favored set of ideals for our political community that are going to keep us safe. So we read the good books that promote our values. I don't agree with that. Nevertheless, I do firmly think that there are some books that are going to fall afoul of my standard, of ones that are going to contract our capacities for the moral imagination rather than expand them. And because I think that the view that I'm supporting here is going to depart from a lot of modern literary approaches to narrative art, and those are the kinds of approaches that we tend to find in the academy. I don't mean to speak for all of my colleagues, but I think this is a dominant approach in literature departments, for instance, and more broadly in the humanities. And the kind of approach that instructors of courses like our first year core curriculum course on literature humanities, of which I'm one, that's the dominant approach among instructors. So here are some ways that it might seem to really be at a distance from what goes on, generally speaking. So one thing you might think is that my view, or the view that I'm sort of sketching out and defending here, commits what's called the biographical fallacy. So the idea would be, okay, so we evaluate the artwork based on what we think about the author. And I'm actually not in favor of that. I think we should set the author aside. And instead, when we're thinking about the ethical power of literature, we should think about the relationship between the text as a material, as a cultural object, and the reader, or the community of readers that are exposed to it. Another mistake I might seem to be making is that I might seem to be committing the intentional fallacy. This is another term that is discussed in literary criticism. And that's the idea that what we should do when we evaluate literature is consider what message the author was trying to communicate to their readers and evaluate that message. And I actually think that my view can survive even the rejection of the intentional fallacy, or the idea that we should be concerned with author intentions. I think it's important to think about what a text might be communicating, but the primary locus of evaluation that I'm interested in is in this relationship between text and reader, and that's consistent with thinking that there are many kinds of acts of communication that are possible, that a text makes possible. I'll close by mentioning two more sort of very potentially controversial aspects of what I'm saying. So one thing you might think is, if I make the ethical evaluation of literature so central, am I not saying that literary critics need help from people like me, from people who do ethics or moral philosophy? And wouldn't that violate the principle that different disciplines have different objects and they can relate to those objects separately? I'm going to say yes. So here's where I'm actually going to take a little controversial stand. We can't do good literary criticism without at least reflecting on ethics. But that's not surprising, because I also think that my discipline, moral philosophy, can't be carried out without the help of disciplines like sociology and anthropology. So what I'm saying is that literary critics should not abandon their moral or ethical sensibilities, and they would be aided in their activity of evaluating literature by reflecting on those moral sensibilities, the ones that they bring to the text, and also the kind of ethical interactions that happen when people engage with literature. And that suggests, I think, a picture of cooperation between different disciplines rather than antagonism. Okay, and the final point I want to make is doesn't this whole picture, this very censorious approach to literature, doesn't it just go against the spirit of humanistic inquiry or the humanities as a whole? So you might think, if there's one slogan for the humanities, it's a line from a play by the Roman playwright, comic playwright Terence, the self-torturers, the play of the Heautontum Ruminos. And there's a famous line that says, "I'm human, so nothing human is alien to me." And that was one of the slogans that Michel de Montaigne put in the roof beams of his famous Tower Library. So this idea that all human things are valuable just because they're human and should engage our concern for that reason. And I agree, my view is resolutely not humanist. Instead, it is what I would call naturalist. So it starts from the idea that what's valuable in human life is a matter of our human nature, our capacities, and that narrative art has a role in the expression of those capacities in a good life as a part of what we might call culture. But instead of thinking about culture as something autonomous, we think about culture and cultural products as how our nature expresses itself in certain times and places. So cultural products don't stand outside ethical evaluation, even if they stand at some remove from our own cultural and historical context. So this enterprise of adopting this ethical stance towards literature, because it's so important, because these literary products and narrative art generally can do harm to us as well as good for us. This whole stance towards narrative art is very, very complicated, and you have to undertake it in a spirit of humility. I'm not recommending that people go out and decide what are the bad books and say, I'm not going to go anywhere near that. But I think just because we want to say that, because we want to make space for cultural pluralism or relativity, just, in some ways, understanding that texts have lives and then they have afterlives, for instance, through the history of readers that come to them. We can acknowledge all of that and still say at the bottom of it that human beings as such are very deeply affected by these cultural products and shaped by them, and we should acknowledge their ethical power. So that's the picture that I support, and I wanted to lay out especially what I take to be controversial in it.
Thank you so much, Professor Jagannathan. I wish that we had a kind of full-throated Wildian among us to sort of disagree with you more forcefully. I'm sort of a half-throated Wildian here, so I will both agree and disagree. So if the question were put to me, should some books not be written? In many ways, I would find that an easier question to answer. I would say, absolutely, there are books that should not be written. That's not the question we're discussing today, or at least not in the first part of this conversation. Just as my view on should some books not be read is that there are books that are extremely, extremely dangerous to read, that are even potentially corrosive, but that ultimately the risks outweigh the benefits. And moreover, that the sort of precise ways in which bad books can be morally corrosive, the best correction for such moral corrosion, in a way, is actually the act of loving, attentive reading. So a bit of background. I'm a 19th century specialist, and so that's very much the field I work in. And it's not necessarily the most optimistic in a certain way about the power of literature, or rather it conceives of the power of the writer as something beautiful and seductive, and also extremely dangerous, even diabolical. I think often of, for example, the Yellow Book in the picture of Dorian Gray, that sort of destroys Dorian's sense of self by infecting his brain with dangerous images. The book being implicitly Joris Karl's Huysmans' Against Nature, which I did my doctorate on, and I think if there was corrosion, I suppose I've suffered from it. And what strikes me as so fascinating in these 19th century texts that has very much affected my own view is the way in which the relationship between the storyteller, the writer, the sort of, even the dandy creating a work of art out of his own life, is a form of diabolical vampirism, in which this sort of powerful storyteller exercises a degree of narrative power over a sort of poor, defenseless reader who, as if they've been infected by some sort of evil spell, becomes kind of possessed by what they read. And the way in which a lot of these writers, including the one I want to talk about most, Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish writer and theologian, the way in which they talk about this phenomenon as being a particular kind of erotic possession, that when someone tells a story, they are able to sort of stand in this godlike position as a kind of miniature god themselves, creating a world for someone in order to exercise power over them. And the position of irony and disengagement, to tell a story and not to be sort of wedded to it, to be in that position of creative mastery, is a sort of particular kind of harmful irony. And I love this line of Kierkegaard's from the concept of irony: the ironist is the vampire who has sucked the blood of the lover, and while doing so has fanned him cool, lulled him to sleep, and tormented him with troubled dreams. The most, I think, best example of this that you, as a phenomenon, is found in a section of Kierkegaard's Either Or, sort of book within a book, called The Seducers Diary, where the narrator, this seducer, Johannes, as he's known, wants to seduce this woman, Cordelia, this sort of young girl. He sees her on the street, he decides he's going to seduce her, and through these series of love letters, the language he writes is he poeticizes himself into a girl. He makes her believe that she's part of this myth, she's an enchanted princess in a wood, and he manipulates her through these texts, through the beauty of his language, into basically doing what he wants before abandoning her. And this idea that creation is something where we can kind of disengage from this perspective of ironic remove, work our way into the minds of others, exert power over them, I think is the model of 19th century dangerous literature that I do subscribe to. So then the question that you might be asking is, well, if she thinks all this about how books are dangerous, like, why is she saying read them anyway? And here is where I depart from the 19th century model, or rather from this particular model. I think that the very qualities that we as human beings sort of need to face this kind of vision of power and power vectors and how we might exert mastery over one another is best responded to through the very virtues that reading and encountering other human beings in a text allows us to do. So I want to sort of present us with a theoretical case here. The worst possible book one might read. An evil genius, the Kierkegaardian seducer, has created a book specifically designed to pollute us in some way, to be morally corrosive, to infect us, to turn us all into Cordelia or Dorian Gray. And this is someone who is an extremely skilled writer at the prose level, who's an extremely convincing writer, and they have created this hypothetical yellow book. Should we read this? What I want to say is very carefully, but yes. And the reason is to subscribe to the notion that this book could exist as an unadulterated evil book is not actually possible, because it would demand a vision of humanity to which I don't ascribe, which is a sort of fully bad person. In this book, I don't think, even in the hypothetical example that I'm giving, where you have someone brilliant and who desires to sort of do us harm, the book itself could not be fully bad, in part because this book can only operate upon us in dialogue with a much wider and much more various set of traditions. There's, of course, the literary expectations both we bring to it, and that any book must sort of be in dialogue with the vast sort of tapestry of literary relations. There is indeed language itself, and the way in which language serves to, it is not the provenance of any one individual. We are indeed in and through language. There is no book. No, there is no yellow book that can have a certain degree of power over us fully, because we as human beings aren't that powerful. There is no story that we can tell that is sort of fully a story that allows us to become, in a sense, miniature gods. We are always contingent beings, in and through one another, in and through the language by which we shape ourselves and shape other people. And because of that, we cannot be, there's no book that can not have that, have at least sort of, perhaps one might say, a spark of goodness, a spark of real humanity. Rather, when we read the virtues that we are sort of called upon to cultivate are the faculty of attention, what it means to go outside ourselves and to focus on something that is strange to us, that is unfamiliar, alien even, and by directing our attentive gaze, the imaginative and receptive powers and rational powers that we have towards an object, we are embracing our vulnerability to other people. We are embracing our vulnerability to what is outside us and to another human being, and indeed the whole sort of vast network of other human beings always present in a text and in language itself. I think that there is perhaps, and I think this is fair, a bit of humanism in this, and I don't know that I would have necessarily thought of myself as a humanist, but I think that the degree to which we encounter another human being in a book, even a bad book, is the kind of cultivation of our ability to be with one another that is so vital. Secondly, I think that there is another level of humanism in this that I've been thinking about as I prepare this over the past few days, which is I think that I have a fundamental optimism in our sort of inherent response to the good. I think, the danger of a bad book, let's say, is that it makes us feel strongly and drawn towards the wrong things. That, and I think that there's one way of looking at it that says, our ability to respond to beauty is independent of any moral truth about ourselves. It's just the sort of fact about us, and we could respond to good beauty and we could respond to bad beauty, and those things, that response might be equally activated and in equal circumstances as long as something is effective. I don't believe that. I think we do absolutely respond positively to things that are bad for us, that are even capital B, bad. But I do have, perhaps optimistically, the conviction that what we respond to in something is always leading us towards something good. We might respond our response might be perverted in some way. We may be looking towards a good and led towards a lesser good or a false good or a false image of that good. But that fundamentally, if we are drawn to the good at the kind of most fundamental level of our being, as I do think we are, then I think that we must while being critical about our own responses to beauty, to texts, still think that there is something, even in the worst book, even in this hypothetical yellow book, worthwhile, that if we respond to it might be but a shadow of what we are ultimately called towards. So that's where I'm coming from.
It struck me as Dr. Burton was talking, I was put in mind of a different 19th century author, Dostoevsky, who has a famous novel, Demons, in which he sort of reimagines demonic possession in light of the ideas of the age, the way ideas can sort of take root in our minds and really direct what we do with our time and energy and money, much the way we read about possession in ancient religious texts. So the question is an old one. When Professor Jagannathan was talking, I was put in mind of the other sort of source of this, the Apology of Socrates, written by Plato, of course, where Plato is charged with corrupting the youth, right? His speech is judged by the city to be somehow corrosive or corruptive. And so this is a long tradition that we stand in the wake of as we begin our discussion tonight. So I think, and I'll open the floor maybe to Dr. Burton first, but I'll pose the question to both of you. You've just conceded, there's no debate that literature has moral power. So maybe we can revisit that, but let's assume that for now, that art in general, literature in particular perhaps, or maybe in a distinct way, involves us in moral engagement, that we can't escape that in some way if we're reading carefully and attentively. So my question is, to start off, what do we bring to a text, right? Because there are no bad texts for someone who can't read the language they're written in, right? Sacred texts and evil texts don't sort of contain magic, right? There's something in the concourse of reading, of interacting with them, that does us good or that does us harm, right? I believe one of the oldest images for the Bible is it's a mirror, right? You sort of see yourself there for better or for worse. So I guess the broad question that I'd open with is, what does it say about us if texts are bad? Is it always that they're bad for us? Do we bring things to them that make them harmful? Do we know ahead of time that a text is bad, or is it only kind of visible in retrospect as it leads us to undertake actions we come to see in hindsight as harmful to us in some way?
I think for me at least, the sight of reading is fun, or the act of reading rather, is fundamentally a sort of extremely personal and intimate encounter. And I think that in reading, what we become is, or what we become all the more aware of is I think a truth that is sort of true of us more generally, which is quite how contingent we are. We are already beings, we are readers of the world around us. We are readers and listeners to the language that we speak, such that I think when there is a kind of complete personal nature to the encounter, I'm willing to say that there may be books that are more dangerous to some than are others. I certainly have my set of, let's say, things to which I am susceptible to morally that perhaps other people, more virtuous than I am in some regards or all regards, might not be susceptible. And I think it sort of then becomes on me to say, this book, I think this book, Valor, I have a weakness for, a certain kind of nostalgic beauty in texts. And I know that if I'm reading, whether it's Stefan Zweig or anything else, that because I have a sort of moral weakness, let's say, it's that much more incumbent on me to guard against it, to be even a little suspicious of myself and my own reactions, even as kind of asking myself the question, what am I longing for here? What is it that I'm longing for? There's that sort of the language of Sehnsucht and the homesickness for a vanished world. And then the question I might ask myself is, what am I actually homesick for in this, account of 19th century Vienna that I'm swooning over, perhaps a little too willing to gloss over, the politics of it because I like the way Stefan Zweig writes. And it's precisely in the questions of how am I vulnerable to this? How am I making myself vulnerable to this? And what am I looking for in this? That I think a more complex conversation that can be had than one that simply says, this novel glorifies this, or this novel glorifies an era that should not be glorified, or even this novel sort of makes me nostalgic in a way that I just personally shouldn't be because I need to guard against that. And I'm therefore, I think I bring quite a lot, and as a result sort of have a kind of a very specific moral duty to ask myself certain questions before and during the reading of any text.
One thing I want to say is that it's very hard to come up with examples of what the yellow book might be. And this makes me less confident in my position and more tempted by Dr. Burton's in some moments. But I'll give you an example, in part because there's the poster of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza behind Professor Floyd. Of course, Don Quixote is a book that's all about how literature, a certain kind of literature, idealistic literature, can distort our worldview and sort of, but also get us in touch with ideals that are against the spirit of the age in important ways. And when I teach Don Quixote, one of the things I want to give my students permission to do is to react to all the violence that it contains, which I think is easy to gloss over. And I do that by pointing them to a remark of Nabokov's in his lectures on Don Quixote, or his lectures on Cervantes that he gave, I think, sometime in the 30s, at Harvard, where he says that Don Quixote is this book of unremitting cruelty, and that it performs a kind of cruelty to its reader. And one reaction we could have is to say, we see all these, in the clash between Don Quixote's ideals and the harsh world that he lives in, we see that ideals don't have any hope again, in fighting against the world ultimately. And of course, the ending of the book is him coming back to his senses at the end of his life, and all the torment that he encounters seems to be for naught. And then of course, there's a much more common reaction of people just to say, no, there's so much of wonder, a kind of wonder at human possibility in the book, that even in these encounters that are cruel, there is a kind of marvelous look at everyday life and the possibilities that it contains, and of course there's supposed to be humor in all the violence, and we might have trouble accessing that sometimes, but that's something we can even appreciate at a distance. So what would it be for Don Quixote to be bad for us? Well, it would be for us to walk away thinking that it's okay to beat people around the head because you don't like them, or you've imagined that there's something other than what you expect, or something like that. And only a very childish reader could, I think, come away from the book thinking that. I actually don't know why Nabokov said what he said. He wasn't a childish reader of literature, of course. He was a brilliant writer in his own right. But the fact of observing the different reactions that different sorts of readers have to texts is part of our duty, I think. And so there's the naive act of reading. There's this sort of flipping through the pages and seeing what happens in a book, especially an exciting one. And then there's reflection on our own reactions, and that is always going to draw in, well, how might my reactions be different from those of someone else? And we find ourselves as part of a community of readers, and especially with these books that have had this readership for 400 years, as Don Quixote has. The community is very big indeed, and there are all these retellings of the story. And of course, that book itself is also about how we are always retelling stories, even as we tell them for the first time. So, but I think we would miss something if we dismissed Nabokov too quickly. We said, oh, Nabokov, you're missing the point. You're supposed to laugh at all the violence. And I think there is a corrosive possibility. I think if Cervantes were less artful, if he were more hostile to humanity, he could have really made it the unremittingly cruel book that Nabokov describes. I actually don't think the Don Quixote we find is that book, but I can imagine my way to thinking that. And it seems like not such a remote possibility when I think, well, here are these things. We can get, as many people have pointed out about film and television, we can get desensitized to violence. I think literature can do that too. I don't think that's a matter of us seeing what Don Quixote does and then trying to do it in our own lives, because we're not Don Quixote, most of us. That's not how we react to literature, but I do think that is a possibility. Once you see something represented, it has a kind of moral actuality for you that can be corrosive and dangerous. And that's sort of what where I would kind of hold on to the idea that there's no yellow book out there, but there are books with little shades of yellow in them.
So your last set of comments kind of brings me to the question I wanted to ask you directly, and then I'll ask Dr. Burton if she agrees with your assessment that the aesthetic and the ethical are indistinguishable, or I should say inseparable. Because where I want to begin asking is they certainly are distinguishable. And that becomes very clear if we think about the opposite, right? We can think about ethical texts that are very bad literature, or movies, or art, or cinema, right? I won't name any because we're being recorded, but we can think of the sort of C-level Christian movie industry, right? Or Christian music industry, perhaps, as an example of songs, movies, narratives that may contain points we agree with, content we find inspiring when delivered from a pulpit, but when it's set to the wrong kind of music or in the wrong narrative frame, it suddenly feels like it doesn't succeed in some way. So clearly, if that's the case, we can distinguish between aesthetic and ethical elements in great books in particular. So why not then say something like, we can distinguish good books from harmful books on aesthetic grounds alone? Why does the ethical piece, I kind of want you to make a stronger case for why the ethical dimensions of a text are sort of inseparable, or at least our account of the text is somehow lacking if they're not considered in addition to the stylistic and other sorts of narrative elements we can identify and isolate from the ethical ones.
Yeah, good. One of the dimensions that I'm interested in is thinking about what we should make of realism in literature. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a helpful way in. So we think of the novel that is celebrated because of its relentless attention to the material reality of life. And that's something that people have said about certain kinds of 19th century novels, and the kind of thing that literary critics go on saying about certain kinds of novels that are written here and now, that, you know, they draw our attention to certain aspects of life, maybe in times and places that we haven't ourselves inhabited, and aim to describe them, and that's their primary mode of operation. And I think one thing we can think is, well, when we say that, is what we're saying merely that we have a kind of journalistic record of what in fact happens in certain times and places? I think we cannot mean that. And that's because the very act of writing fiction, in particular, involves understanding how to make the real come through from the page to the minds of the reader. Mm-hmm. And that involves certain kinds of idealizations, right? Like even the notion of a character or a plot is an idealization. That's a matter of structure. Mm-hmm. And continuity of various kinds. And so we're already involved in, you know, the way that the real is manifested to us is through certain kinds of idealizations. So I think the debate about realism versus idealism in the novel you know, I think that's getting at something important, but it can't be the full story. Those terms sort of need to be unpacked in an important way. And I think what that gets us to see is that, you know, if there's any ethical content, you know, it's in those idealizations themselves. That means that, you know, we can't say of a book, well, it's good because it's so realistic. Or what we mean is it describes accurately what happens in certain times and places. That's not really what realism comes to. And I think that's where we see how the aesthetic dimensions and the ethical dimensions are fused together. What I'm really providing is a kind of image for that. You know, the realistic and the idealistic dimensions are kind of fused together in some important way. So that's one aspect. And I'll flip it around. And of course, structure and plot can have aesthetic dimensions too. So we might say of some piece of narrative art that has a very satisfying resolution to some of its central problems or tensions or something like that. So, you know, there's a certain way in a book is elegant if it ties up its loose ends in the right way. But what does in the right way mean? Can we give a purely formal description of that? Interestingly, the Victorians themselves, you know, did not think of form in that way. So there's this very long tradition of thinking that the appropriateness of form is itself a matter of responding to certain kinds of human needs. You know, whether that's of the characters who are being described in their situations, but also of the readers again. And that there is a sort of ethical relationship implicated in that, even in that very purely formal vocabulary. So, you know, the idea of a resolution of a plot, again, it might seem like we're dealing with something purely aesthetic, but we dig a little bit deeper and we see, I think there are some ethical elements there. So what I mean, you know, the reason that I think this in the first place is for very abstract philosophical reasons about the nature of value. I don't think there is a dimension of aesthetic value that exists apart. This is something that I'm firmly, resolutely against a certain kind of modern approach to thinking about value in human life. I'm very much allied with ancient and medieval ways of thinking about it. But there aren't these different, you know, there might be different aspects of goodness that we can tease apart in order to talk about them, but not in the nature of the thing itself. So, you know, especially because I'm focusing in on the activity of meaning making that happens when readers read texts, that activity is saturated with both aesthetic and ethical dimensions, and I think that's just sort of in the nature of things. But I gave a couple of examples of ways that these values kind of come together in the actual practice of literary criticism.
If I could follow up briefly before turning to Dr. Burton, would you say that it's one thing to talk about Plato or Kierkegaard or Nabokov, but would you say any text, any sort of reader interaction has an ethical dimension to it?
I think there could be ways of, let's call it, consuming media, which don't have, where the, the significance of the act is the fact that someone is doing it rather than doing something else. So there's some ethical content there, but I'm not going to say that idly having the television on in the background, or maybe it's the beach read that I'm thinking of, flipping through a book on the beach. What do we mean by ethical? It needn't be a very significant or weighty act. I think that's true. But I think as soon as our capacities for attention are engaged in any kind of a significant way, and I very much, as Dr. Burton brought up, I like this concept of attention. Once that attention is there, then all of a sudden I think, the ethical possibilities are actualized. What is our attention going to and why? And how is our capacity for attention being shaped by this particular instance of our attending?
Great. So as we turn to Dr. Burton, once again, do you agree with Dr. Jagannathan's assessment that the ethical and the aesthetic are sort of inseparable? And maybe as a follow-up, because it was something you spoke to, what is the ascesis or the discipline of reading? What is in that does something that makes it ethical and formative for us? So
yes, absolutely. I'm completely in agreement of the inextricability of the aesthetic and the ethical. Here is sort of the point on which I construct my understanding of how those things work together. I think that something that the cliche Christian movie that you do not name and the Yellow Book have in common, that make them both bad and sort of aesthetically dangerous, and perhaps in the case of this movie, aesthetically bad, but actually I think morally bad, is a certain kind of dehumanization or reducing people to character, and character to serve a function of plot. You see this, for example, in the creation of Cordelia or Dorian Gray in this particular way, but you see it too in like the bad book that a crime writer at a festival once brought up as example, and I think about this, like the book where like the beautiful dead woman is there and we're going to enjoy that she's beautiful and dead. Isn't it great that she's beautiful and dead because we now have a sexy story about who killed her? That sort of dehumanization you also see in movies that say that, or films or movies or films, I would say novels or films that may say they have a sort of moral message, but reduce their characters, reduce human beings to ideas. That sort of the dehumanization of the other, that I think in a text, whatever the ostensible moral message, is actually ethically bad and likely to be aesthetically bad, because if you have black characters, generally we notice. I think that the act of reading is a fostering of attention towards another human being, or sort of other human beings, both in terms of the how might we respond to the character on the page, how might we even have imaginative possibilities for them beyond what an author gives us. What were they thinking? What's their story? If they were the narrator of the story, what would this be like? Actually, I think Dostoevsky is one of my favorite writers, is a great example, precisely because so many of his novels are sort of polyphonic in as Bakhtin said, in the way that gives each character a kind of center of consciousness. Even your characters you see for 2 pages are full in that way. And I think that direction of attention towards, like I said, the humanity of the character, the humanity of the author, the sense that we are encountering something alien to us, and training in that recognition as a kind of almost mystical, but I'll go on and say, mystical process. I think that is where the sort of ethical and the aesthetic converge, also because I do think that we as human beings have a sense when that is happening and when it isn't. Now, a different question is, can we take pleasure? Can we enjoy something, a piece of art, that is not ethical? And I think, yes, that is true. And that is where I sort of aesthetically judge it. Do we take, whether it's an erotic pleasure or the kind of perverse pleasure of the horror movie where we like enjoy watching someone die horribly. There are sort of what I might call unvirtuous pleasures we might take in a text, in which I think that, let's say, the dangerous aesthetic texts, often which do tend to, it's worth saying, either are erotic or sort of the eroticization of violence. Those are often the ways, or the sort of aspirational, like, let's present you with this beautiful image of beautiful people being wealthy and fabulous, which is a sort of another genre of pleasure read that's quite common. I think all of these are ways in which our desires are sated by texts. But that is, I would not necessarily say that those are the same things as being aesthetically good, even as I recognize that I recognize that I might be sort of linking the ethical and the aesthetic there, and by sort of saying bad aesthetics is something different. So I recognize I'm open to that.
We could say something like bad books can be beautiful, or sort of provoke something in us. Professor Jagannathan, did you want to add an example? I think
just one example. I mean, I think if you're coming from Plato or Kierkegaard, our attention is drawn to precisely to the kind of by the horrible things in human life being aestheticized in the wrong way, or the misdirected erotic impulse. I'm interested in a phenomenon in modern literature, which I see represented even in a lot of quite fine, what's considered fine literature, which is the promotion of a certain kind of cynicism. That really to look at human life is to see that there's no meaning there ultimately, and to dress that up in a couple of hundred pages of excellent writing. And I think that's more terrifying to me than the pulp fiction novel or something like that, because I think it's much more insidious. It's harder to spot, and it's one of the examples that got me thinking about this question that really radicalized me, because I had the kind of response, well, of course the thing can be beautiful, even if it's not ethically improving. But then I started to think, well, there's certain other ways of directing our capacities for attention elegantly that are corrupting or dangerous, that are much harder to spot than the kind of refined beauty example, or the aestheticized horror example. And so I wonder if we shouldn't keep track of that too. That cynicism is I think one of the great dangers of modern life, and one of the things that a lot of the narrative art that we encounter tends to promote.
Very interesting. You had me thinking that you're sort of saying better off to read the Marquis de Sade than Nietzsche, but I won't press you on that distinction. I wanted to ask, and maybe Dr. Burton, we can start with you. I think you raised very clearly this helpful distinction between individual assessments of harmful texts and sort of corporate or civic assessments, social assessments of those. And it came up in both of your opening comments. So beginning with you, Dr. Burton, how you spoke more about the personal or sort of individual assessment. I think that maybe makes sense to us. I can recognize I don't listen to this album when I'm not feeling well or like sad about my life, or I know where these sorts of texts leave me at the end of them. Do you think there could be, especially in our pluralistic society, a sort of collective assessment that certain texts or a text, especially given, as you pointed out, the polyvalent nature of so many of the most compelling texts, could we arrive at a consensus that a particular text is harmful for us as a society?
My hope is that as a society we might be able to, which is to say, I think that a good society, again, speaking about ideals then and not actualities, is one that cares for the common good, and part of that caring for the common good is a kind of full-throated moral commitment to what is good. Do I think that this is viable or possible? At least in any society that I sort of can imagine anytime soon or ever? No, I don't trust any, let's say, institution to ever be able to safeguard well this particular question. And I think, again, the dangers outweigh the risks. If we had, the heavens opened and list of dangerous books came down to us, great. But I think that as I would not want to rely on any human institution to institute such warnings.
I'm going to say, bring back the index. Yes, the institutions will be imperfect, but really what I mean, the time that I think about this the most keenly is thinking about my role as a teacher. And because I teach in the Columbia core curriculum, I'm handed a syllabus and told to teach it. And I'm supposed to teach every book on it and no books that aren't on it. Well, there's a little bit of freedom, not terribly much. And one of the things that it got me thinking is sort of, what is the kind of moral authority that is involved in that? I think it would be easy to say, well, here are some important books, or here's a selection of things that are worth your time because they'll lead you to interesting questions in various ways. And I think that's fine. We can be provisional with that. But I think we should also take seriously the possibility that we, in recommending certain kinds of literature, are harming our students. And I think this about philosophy classes too, that, it's a little bit of a joke, but on the first day of my ancient philosophy class, I teach the apology, and I tell students, look, what Socrates is telling us is that philosophy is dangerous. It's important, it's necessary to get ourselves to know the truth about these things, but those truths might be bad for you. They might make your life actually go worse. And I think that's something that people don't give too much attention to in philosophy either. And I think it's true in both cases that, and that means that we can't defer these questions. We have to decide for ourselves, do the benefits outweigh the dangers? And I think for the most part, the books we test have stood a kind of test of time. And I'm not like Augustine. I don't think that the Aeneid is terrible because it leads you to valorize worldly things too much. See this as I don't watch superhero movies, and I think they're bad. And
saying Marvel's pernicious.
I think they do valorize the wrong. Yeah, I think Marvel is pernicious. I think they lead us to valorize the wrong things. I've acquainted myself with a few of them to make sure this is a partly informed opinion. But I think these things are seductive, and we should keep our distance from them. It becomes very different when you're talking about something like the Aeneid or Don Quixote. But I think we should maybe in some other form of society it would make sense to have something like an index where it wouldn't be you can't read this and still be a good person, or we'll kick you out or something like that. But here's a little bit of a warning label on something, and maybe fascist art should come with these kinds of warning labels too. I'm not against that. I'm not against Netflix putting a little thing before Gone with the Wind. I'm all for that kind of contextualization, because I think it's important, and it underwrites just how susceptible we can be if we're not familiar. Very few of us are familiar with the histories of these cultural objects that we encounter and that we just sort of absorb, and we ought to be more careful than we generally are. So.
I think I have two more questions, and then we're going to turn it over to some student questions. Just a reminder to our audience to please continue to put your questions in the Slido service that we've offered. So thinking about harmful texts in an election year, and I think, Dr. Burton, you brought out nicely how porous we are as readers to the world that we live in, the world that many contemporary texts that come to us come out of. How do we know, can we know, what are the signs in advance that a text we're reading is actually harmful or merely is a protest to the world that we assume to be the case, right? So it seems to me that texts that rightly or wrongly are labeled as harmful or pernicious or corrosive in some way are precisely those texts that take a stand against the ideas of their age. And we can't know ahead of time necessarily whether those are the ideas against which they propose an alternative are good ideas we should be promoting, or bad ideas that we've become sort of just accepted uncritically. So is there a way in I guess, do you know a text is harmful ahead of time? And as you read it, how do you know when you're actually being asked to question, perhaps really uncomfortably, values that you've taken for granted? or when a text is really proposing a view of the world or the human person or human agency that is really harmful in some way. So maybe we can start with Dr. Burton and then turn to Dr. Jagannathan.
For me, I think the sort of number one indicator, and this is again reflective of my own system of values, and I do grant that, but I think it is about how human are the people in this text allowed to be. Is this a text, whether it is a, we can talk about news story, sure, but I'm thinking again still about the novel most prominently, but do people serve the story? Are there roles in a text to move the plot along, to be fetishized, to be an object of aspiration, to be a place where we can insert ourselves and fantasize? And I think this is where the cynical gaze, I think really, or Professor Jagannathan, where your kind of the cynical gaze really gets us something and reminds me a lot of the sort of ironic remove of the vampire writer of the 19th century. Are human beings just little ants at whom we laugh? Do these characters exist in a sense for our amusement, whether it's for our erotic pleasure, for our fantasizing, or for us to laugh at, to mock? And I think that there's a difference even in, and I think this is what I love about Don Quixote, that you can sort of laugh gently at a character up to a point, but we don't sort of fully mock him in the sense of, or maybe we do, but I don't certainly think that, I think maybe a lesser Don Quixote could have fallen victim to that. But I think this is a person. This is a human being, and in that kind of full humanity, this is someone into whom we could imagine ourselves, not because we are imagining ourselves into the role of the, in the pulp example, the person who sort of gets the professional success and the romantic happy ending and is secretly the princess all along, or what have you, but a sense in which we might imagine ourselves into someone different, and in so doing expand our sense of who we are, who we might be, and kind of break open this idea of ourselves as enclosed from the world. We become vulnerable to another person. And I think that taking that as our ethical starting point, are the people in this novel people? Again, with perhaps a little bit of conviction on my part that this is a sense that this is something we can respond to, that we are able to intuit that we have a moral sense that allows us to accurately gauge whether that is going on. That is the sort of defining point of whether this is sort of a good book or a bad book, less than any ideals it is trying to get across, because it may well be that some of my ideals in this modern world of ours are terribly wrong and need to be changed, and it may be that the ideas coming to me from this book are a mix of good and bad. It's really the ethical character that I want to pin down is not in the ideas it is conveying in a certain way, but in its treatment of human beings in the text.
Thank you very much. Dr. Jagannathan?
Yeah, I'll just add to that one thing. Yes, the idea of sort of characters serving our interests, I think that's sort of an important source of the dubious character of some narrative art. Of course, this whole enterprise is very difficult. I wanted to sort of circle back to my saying that. I mean, if you look at just lists of banned books, for instance, you'll find the ALA, the American Library Association, has got this list of banned books, and the top 10 in the last 10 years is really interesting to look at. It's a very heterogeneous list, and on that list is 50 Shades of Grey. And I'm not going to assume sort of why people want to ban that one way or the other, but I might even have some sympathy with that. Tango Makes Three is also on the list, which is this children's book about penguins who live in Central Park. And these kinds of discussions, they get roped into broader conversations about what are societal values and what we mean by that in a deeply pluralist society. I think we can give up on the idea that there's some source of unequivocal authority that's going to, the list of banned books that comes from the sky. We can give up on that possibility, and even so, sort of, give some space to the kinds of conversations that, this sort of conversation about what might make for, and I think books can be exploitative, not just of their characters, but also of their readers in various ways. And one way that exploitation can occur is precisely by confirming back to them exactly what they come into the book with. That is a form of exploitation, in my view, or at least in terms of sort of serious fiction or narrative art. I think it's one of the kind of important failings of some large chunk of modern literature that it tends to do that for its readers. And so, we can't rely on the frisson of disgust that we feel, or horror, or whatever it is. That needs interrogation. And I'm not advocating for a kind of morally censorious attitude where we take for granted that we have the right values and we can take those values out in the world and sort of detect the good literature and put aside the bad.
I think you've both suggested in a way that if there are pernicious books, we find that out as the result of a process of discernment as we engage them, as we reflect on them. And of course, they're not our only input for ethical formation and perspective. And so they're always in conversation with other influences. So before we turn over to the students, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like you to address it with our undergraduate audience in mind. How do I know the difference as a student, maybe as a scholar and a professor too, between being bored or confused or angry at a book and being unduly influenced or harmed by it in some way? Are there some, maybe two telltale signs that, to use your language, Dr. Jagannathan, that my horizon is being limited in a harmful way rather than being challenged in a helpful way? So how would I know that?
I mean,
Dr. Jagannathan, if you want to go first, yeah.
Yeah, one thing I think this is really important. This always happens on the first day of class with literature humanities, where we tend to start off with the Iliad, and the students say, well, why do we have to read the catalog of ships? And I like to sort of head this response off by giving them this little poem by one of my favorite Russian poets, Osip Mandelstam, which is called, I think it's called Insomnia. And the narrator of the poem is sort of falling asleep while reading. He has insomnia, and so he goes to read the catalog of ships in order to fall asleep. And what I think is wonderful about that is Eden's capacity for lulling us to sleep depends on the rhythmic character of the verse. The repetition is actually part of the point. And once we see that, we can maybe see past our boredom to see a kind of wonder even in that. And we have this fellow reader of alongside us, Mandelstam, that wonderfully draws our attention to that. And then, of course, we can have a serious conversation about how Homer's original audience, or the original oral audience for the Iliad, would have loved hearing about all the different places and how it would have taken them geographically in their mind. And our problem is that we don't know all these place names, and so we have to look at a map to follow along. But you can kind of feel the narrator of the Iliad taking us on this massive geographical tour. And then that's a different way of kind of accessing sort of what the point of this boring stretch is. I'm also reminded of one of my very favorite recent books is a novel by Elif Batuman, named after Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot. Mm-hmm. And a lot of critics really thought, the second half of this novel is so slow and so flabby, and it goes on for 100 pages too long. And I really think, that there's so much of wonder if you read something slowly enough. That if you slow down, if you fight against your own boredom, and you see what are the human possibilities that are being described, what world is being evoked for me, what feelings is the author drawing out in me. Those are reflective. It's a reflective posture that we can take, and I think even literary critics can get this wrong. I think the second half of The Idiot is one of the most marvelous things in sort of recent American fiction, and I'm very fond of Elif Batuman. That's part of it, is that I sort of have the capacity to see that in the text, because she's also a travel writer. And I think, again, just like with Homer's geographical mood, sometimes a book is slow because it's trying to evoke a certain time and a place. And so I think that we can develop these kinds of habits. And the best thing to do is to read a lot of different kinds of things. And so you can start to find wonder in more of it, which is not to say that, there's some things that are just boring, and that's an okay conclusion to end up drawing to.
Dr. Burton, how do we know the difference between being harmed by a book and being challenged to grow by a book?
So I'm actually also going to defend boring books. As you were talking, Professor Jagannathan, I was put in mind of Simone Weil's essays on boredom and attention, and precisely. I think we're all agreeing that books should be boring. I'm not sure how I feel about the implications of this, but there is something to the directed attention of something challenging outside of the self that I think that is morally good, and one might say the kind of converse to that, or the way in which one might be harmed if sort of surface level satisfied by a book, is to come away with it sort of self-satisfied. I'm on the right track. Things are going kind of well for me. I'm a better person. I'm definitely a better, like the worst thing I think you could feel about a book is like, well, I feel better about my own life now. Those fools doing terrible things to each other. At least I'm not them. And I think that sense of, I won't say moral certainty, but a kind of comfort with one's own life as compared to the lives of the people we've just read about, or a kind of sense of also satisfaction that everything turned out sort of exactly as it should, and I think this is sort of the pulp rather than the cynical danger, but the idea of, well, life works a certain way and you've just got to do X, Y, and Z thing and then it'll all be fine and you'll have the happy ending. And I think both of those are forms of self-satisfaction and certainty. So I think that actually books should destabilize you in such a way, and the way in which I think a sort of the harmful destabilizations that you find in these sort of 19th century figures, for what it's worth, are books that sort of provide an image of, I mean, it's usually, to be frank, quite erotic in these books. It's books that are alluring because they offer either beauty or the account of a beautiful woman dying very slowly under mysterious circumstances, or something like that, where the seduction is always framed as a kind of form of sexual desire. We're lustful for the ending. We're lustful to see the horrible thing happen to the woman on the the railroad tracks, or we're lustful to see the murder happen in slow motion in a really gory detail. It's that sort of unsettling, that is the mechanism in these bad yellow books by which kind of harm comes, where it stokes our desire, makes us want to see a bad thing happen or to enjoy bad things happening to the characters. And I think that's that sort of, if we're enjoying the bad fate of the people in a book, whether it be oh well, they got their comeuppance, or well, they're so stupid, or ooh, that beautiful woman died very slowly. I think all of those are examples of a kind of moral corrosion in what we're reading.
Great, excellent. So we're going to turn to some student questions now, or questions from the audience. The first one is for you, Dr. Burton, regarding your point of the impossibility of an entirely evil book. A student or an audience member at least asked, even if no human is entirely evil, can they still not perform an entirely evil act? And I guess I interpret that to be, it seems like we can point to pernicious men and women who write books and philosophies and things. So is it possible that a book can really be harmful because of who wrote it, or what it says, or how their life influenced what they wrote?
I certainly think, if we're talking about like the political ramifications of a book, yes, sure, a book can be sort of cause such harmful things to happen that we might consider in that category. But I think speaking purely at the level like of, do I personally read this book? I think that there are indeed sort of pernicious people who can write books designed to convince us of pernicious ideas while framing it in pernicious ways. And all of those things are true. But I think precisely because we are not fully autonomous beings, but precisely because as human beings, we are contingent in language, we are contingent upon story. The very expectations and of genre of narrative are themselves kind of received and given to us and communal. No human being could kind of could have such power over text itself, other than, I don't know, by hypothetically writing their own language in such a way as we could not even understand a book that was purely evil, precisely because the way in which that the ideas and notions and language of our hypothetical villainous author make their way to us is through so many layers of a kind of wider human discourse. And unless we're willing to kind of consign all of them, then we can't say that a book is really only the product of its author. And so no matter how pernicious the author, there is still something of a kind of greater humanity in what we see, which again is why I think that in reading and recognizing this and recognizing kind of our own place in this contingency as sort of constant readers of texts around us, it allows us to push back against the kind of vampiric, ironic remove that is itself the source of such, I would say, wickedness.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding your last comment there correctly, the author, him or herself, is contingent and porous. And so in many ways, an evil book is discontinuous with itself because it inevitably has elements of the broader human experience that in manipulating it reveals its own sort of inconsistency or something like that.
Absolutely, and it's actually something that I really enjoy. And there's a sort of common ending to a lot of these 19th century books, which is always that the sort of attempt at self-isolation and power and mastery at the end of these books, like whether it's the end of Huysmans' Against Nature, the Yellow Book itself, like it always fails. It always falls apart. These stories always get kind of broken in on by another voice, another truth, nature itself. There's one novel I'm thinking of, a version of this, Villiers' Tomorrow's Eve, where like there's an unexpected shipwreck at the end. And there's always that sense of the world breaks in. We aren't autonomous. Any attempt to pretend to be, like our attempts to be autonomous and in this role of ironic mastery are both at the heart of the wickedness of text, but also are like, it's wrong. It is a wrong statement about the human condition. And reading helps us realize that more fully.
Thank you very much. Professor Jagannathan, what are some of the works of art that you think should not be read and why?
I've only got one good answer to that. And that's in part because worrying about the novels of Michel Houellebecq is how I got thinking about these questions about a year and a half ago. I was writing about his Soumission, his book about a near future Islamic takeover of France. And I wouldn't, maybe I agree with Dr. Burton that I wouldn't want any political authority to go and withdraw his faculty to write novels or something like that. But I think the world would be better if no one read those books, his books in particular. And that's in part because he's always writing the same story. The protagonists of his novels are always himself, thinly disguised, and the plot is relatively similar. And what changes is the kind of imaginativeness of the setting. He's a kind of sort of fantastic fiction or science fiction writer, and so there's you pick up a new one and it looks different to you. But if you sort of peel back, what's there, what you're getting is I think quite a despairing vision of humanity and a lot of hatred directed towards people. There's enough layers of irony in Soumission that there's a kind of thinly veiled celebration of how, well, if France were Islamic, then people would be morally serious. But of course, the joke is that it's impossible to be morally serious in the modern world, and anyone wants is power and sex anyway. So even the irony, as Dr. Burton was talking, in these books, the irony, the world ends up rupturing the irony at some point. There's a tissues of self-contradiction, as you were yourself saying, Professor Floyd. So my sense, I would not want. I would want to put this on the reader beware list rather than the index. But That's my best example, and it's and maybe it's just my personal. I hate those books very much, and I hate Soumission in particular. So I'll say that.
Fair enough. Dr. Burton, another question for you, as a novelist yourself. Is the aspiring artist, writer, painter, musician, etc., more or less vulnerable to the corrupting influence of ethically suspect art, if such an influence exists?
So instinctively, I think that we must be, speaking as a novelist myself, in part because I think that there is a kind of desire for control, or there's a sort of power to shape that happens when we write, and let me reframe this slightly differently. I think that if you're going to write, if you're going to sort of take on the mantle of creation and create something that is might well be corrosive to someone else, there is all the more responsibility. And I think that because there is a sort of impulse to create, and that impulse is so often polluted and perverted as one that is an impulse of mastery, I think it is likely that art, that kind of a certain kind of showy literary art where the it's hard because I actually do enjoy Stendhal very much, but like Stendhal's The Red and the Black, where he's just sort of smirking at his stupid characters being stupid the whole time. I think that posture of remove is something that's quite intoxicating. Isn't it fun to know more than our characters? Isn't it fun to sort of whisper, oh, what fools these mortals be? And I think that that's something that we ought to guard against as would-be writers, as would-be creators of any kind. But I'm not sure if there's a sort of temperamental susceptibility, or it's simply that we all as human beings are susceptible to that, and it's just that once we start writing or painting, that's where we might take those bad lessons we've learned and reinscribe them. That I'm not sure of.
Thank you. Dr. Jagannathan, I'm assuming the next question is for you because it picks up on your discussion of idealism, the idealism implicit in any realist novel. So how does a free society guard itself against idealism's usurpation of political power, while at the same time ensuring the flourishing of various idealisms?
Yeah, good. I think we should not be afraid of having too many ideals. I mean, we should always be afraid of having too few, and in particular, simplistic ones. So, I think, important political movements that have contributed to our common flourishing, where that's widely and properly understood, have been very idealistic. One good example is the spread of the techniques of nonviolence in various kinds of civil rights struggles in the 20th century. That from say Gandhi to Martin Luther King to Nelson Mandela, in various ways. These kinds of ideals, they were sort of like, it was like a package. This ideal of nonviolence combined with certain kinds of resistance, and saying that when people are being oppressed, then they ought to resist that oppression. And the best way to do that is to manifest the oppression into public, because the oppressor always wants the oppression to be hidden. And nonviolence is something that could be plugged into that political problem as a certain kind of ideal. And of course, there are powerful literary expressions of these ideals too, fictional, nonfiction as well. And if you think about the letter from Birmingham jail of Martin Luther King, you have to understand a lot about its historical context to even understand what he's talking about. And yet it's got this literary afterlife where it can be, exported and thought about in a different context too. So I'm very, I'm very friendly to these kinds of ideals. But of course, there's also the kind of ideal that tries to occlude certain things about ourselves. So I think, again, I'm going to draw on my own views here. I think nationalist political ideals tend to be self-occluding, that they understate the difference that exists, the human diversity that exists even within an ethnos or a nation. And so they're self-undermining, and so they they can't stand up to very much scrutiny. You know, the story is always messier than it is. So if you look at 19th century nationalist movements, you know, and my favorite example is the Finnish case, where the national epic had to be invented because there weren't the right sources going back far enough, and so it just had to be invented out of whole cloth. Whereas, you know, some of the other countries, you could go to the linguistic tradition and recover an ancient epic and say, oh, that's our national epic, here's our national story. But where that's missing, you've just got to invent one. You know, so I think, you know, that shows us that you know, the way that literary and political ideals can operate together, and you know, there's the kind of ideal that tries to be self-occlusive, and I think those are the ones that we can that don't stand up to intellectual scrutiny. I'm an optimist. You know, I think the ideals can sneak in very easily, and we grow up before we have the capacities for critical reflection, having absorbed so many of them already, including in sort of forms of storytelling that we're deeply familiar with, that are, I think, you know, often pernicious, or precisely because they're simplistic. And so we come equipped to read stories by having absorbed storytelling techniques that are themselves, you know, potentially problematic. But I think, you know, these sort of practices of critical reflection and communities of readership, wide communities of readership, are kind of an important way of resisting that. And I guess I'm optimistic in the political case too, that we can really scrutinize these ideals and see who they're serving.
So let me ask you a brief follow-up. If we're envisioning a society in which, like our own, a sort of plural society in which a sort of consensus around certain ideals are held by individual communities, and those communities don't coincide, right? So the text that community A deems as harmful are the red text, and the text of community B are the blue text. What ought our attitude be towards the harmful texts of other communities, or texts whose communities absorb our harmful texts and see them as sort of thought-provoking or helpful or constructive in some way? Like, how do we, this idea of flourishing idealism in the question, I think, might have been trying to get at, when my text, or my sacred text, or your non-sacred text, and vice versa, like, how do we navigate not only the sort of horizontal dimension you've described of within a community sort of discerning things that are helpful from things that are harmful, but in a larger community of communities that recognizes we don't all come to the same conclusions about which text ought to be read and which ought to be avoided?
Good, yeah. I mean, I think I have this model of, you know, that emphasizes learning from the experience of other readers. And there's always more dissension within communities than the communities themselves like to recognize. And that might not be obvious at a given time, but I think it tends to be obvious over time, over long spans of time, where, you know, that community and the readers within it are subjected to certain kinds of pressure that are endogenous, you know, intellectual pressure from within, as long as there are the resources for certain kinds of critical reflection that are made available. So, you know, the problems tend to arise from cases where, you know, something has a kind of moral authority over us, and it's a kind of unquestioned authority. So we might think, you know, I'll give you an example from philosophy. A number of political philosophers think that the American Constitution is irredeemable. Irredeemable because it's old and dysfunctional and causes some various problems with our political system, or because it inscribes certain kinds of oppressive structures. There's lots of reasons that people think that you know, we ought to dispense with it. And then the question becomes, are there the resources within the American constitutional and jurisprudential traditions for certain kinds of critical reflection? And those resources have been found where, you know, this is not the first period where people have been wondering about this. And you can think about the period around the Civil War as a period where the American Constitution was rewritten without changing the text, you know, always, but re-understood, you know, for a new generation of readers. And we can think about, you know, how the 14th Amendment was an attempt to rewrite the Bill of Rights in certain ways, so it implicitly addressed all people, and rather than just property-owning white men, for instance. So, you know, and that's because of, you know, there's, you know, the processes for that kind of critical reflection belong to the community, not to the text. And so no text itself is going to generate its own set of critical resources. I think there's some texts that invite it more than others through their pronouncements and their silences, and that might have some role. But we have to discipline ourselves to being intellectually curious and also not too easily self-satisfied readers, whatever kind of text we come to.
Dr. Burton, I've got sort of two questions here that are related, so I'm going to ask you them both. I suspect you may take issue with the framing of the first, but I'll ask it as it's written. How will we know books are too dangerous to be read before reading them? And then the second part is basically, is literature distinct from other forms of art in its capacity for perniciousness?
So I think I'll answer the second one first and work back to the first one, which is I think what literature does that is kind of distinct for me is in its sort of creation of, let's say, an imaginary world, by which I could mean just another version of our quote unquote world, that the sort of creative power one has in creating that world and creating the rules in it and the sort of expectations of it is sort of godlike in a particular way, which is to say, I think about this a lot. I would make the case that any sort of novelistic world or any narrative literary world has an implicit theology to it. You can talk about, does God exist in this book? Does fate exist in this book? Not just, in the sense of, does this book have an explicit sort of divine hand, but what are the assumptions underpinning that? And I think that what are the, what is human nature in this book? What is, is there order to this world? Is there meaning? And what does it therefore say about our own? I think that that particular power to create not just people and the relations to one another, but a whole kind of implicit metaphysic is striking. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's unique. I, in a sense, don't know enough about the creation of, let's say, other forms of non-narrative art to have an opinion there. But that is why I think, or where I see the distinctiveness of the creation of the literary narrative world. To answer the first question, I don't exactly think I think there's something to the wisdom of tradition. I think that one might get a sense from past readings or from even knowing the subject matter, something of the danger of the work. I think of one of the books I think no one should really ever read, although or should be very careful about reading. Let's say is Octave Mirbeau's The Torture Garden. It's right there on the tin. It's just it's 100 pages of very beautifully written accounts of horrors of the 19th century. But I think that really, as we've said before this conversation, it is because so much of my understanding of the corrosive quality of a book comes in its treatment of its characters. That isn't something you necessarily can get from knowing about its subject matter or knowing about its history. You could have a pretty good idea that if it's a piece of fascist propaganda art, it might see human life in a certain way. But then again, perhaps not. And I do want to reiterate, though, when I think that it is possible, again, as an act of conscious attention and as an active rather than merely passive or consumerist approach to reading, one might ask oneself, what does it mean to come to this text with this sort of commitment to human fullness already? What does it mean, for example, to read Torture Garden? Again, this book that came up in me, had to write about for my doctoral thesis, and did not enjoy the process. But what does it mean to wonder about each of these people we're seeing kind of mutilated and tortured in horrible ways? What was their life? What did they want? Who did they love? To ask ourselves that, even resisting the desire of a text to tell us, oh, well, isn't this great? And isn't this sort of seductive? And aren't you just carried away by the beautiful awfulness of it all? To sort of resist, I think the way to resist a text is to kind of ask ourselves, even at the level of imagination, almost at the level of creating a kind of alternate text for ourselves, of the mental fan fiction of what happened to these characters after the text before. That's an act that I think we can do constantly to guard against the corrosive act of a book once we're in it, or even as we go into it.
Mm-hmm. And would you, one brief follow-up, would you say the response to a pernicious text, a harmful text, is it to stop reading it? Is it to read it? Is it to countermand it, counter-narrate it in some way? Any sort of quick follow-up for the student who finds herself or himself in the middle of a harmful text?
Absolutely. I think it is about the countermanding, which is in a sense also the sort of creation of an alternate text. There is that sort of the creative response of resistance to say, no, these human beings that you mock, that you think little of, that you objectify, are, imagine futures for them, to be open to it, as well as to be open, I think, in the text to who wrote this, what were they tending towards, what good were they looking for? Unless, again, we want to sort of consign this human being to a kind of irremediable place, then a question to ask is there something in this pernicious text? Is there a good that they're aiming for or missing? If they're aiming for something bad, why are they aiming for that? And what is that a perversion of? And if we can, I think if we're, just to give one example, if we are saying, this is an eroticization of a certain kind of violence, and this is trying to titillate us in a certain way, well, what does that mean, for ideas of connection, of genuine love? Where are those needs or those hungers in this text? And are these what are being kind of perverted or changed into a desire to kind of, again, eroticize suffering? So that's just one example, but I think the reading is at once an act of loving attention, but also a kind of refusal to dehumanize anyone, both within the text and indeed the author themselves.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're coming to the end of our time, so I'll ask this last question to Professor Jagannathan first, but to both of you. And I laugh as I read it because I read for the first time Master and Margarita, Bulgakov's novel, this summer. And perhaps this student or audience member did too, because they ask, what sort of story would the devil write? What sort of story is most perilous or harmful?
Well, I think I'm beginning to think that the devil may quote scripture, but not write theology. So, one interesting point is sort of how much of a world does a piece of narrative art project from what we are given? If we take the text as a kind of basis, do we then get implicitly not just a metaphysic, but an account of the whole world behind it, and the rules for such worlds holding together well enough that the book can hold well enough together? My suspicion is that it would be very difficult to contrive something very generic, something sort of, say, fully imaginative, fully removed from some set of particular circumstances, that would sort of fail to project some image of the world back to us. But I do think, and this is maybe coming back to the point about realism and hyper-realism even, that maybe what I want to say is, the kind of book that the devil would write would be one that tried to project our world back to us. Even that act is radical, but it comes with a set of possibilities too. But look, this is all there is to human life. It's the life you're living now. Don't look for anything beyond it. And there is something a little bit diabolical in quite a lot of literature that I read for this reason. But of course, The Master and Margarita is not such a book.
I think actually that cynical gaze, I think for me would be, especially thinking back about, the 19th century conception of the devil often was of this sort of bourgeois ironist to begin with. But I think a very cutting, very elegant book that about how simultaneously in which in which life is meaningless and there is sort of no resolution on that level, in which people are weak and feeble and we're meant to laugh at it. And yet that is so elegantly tied up in a bow that we don't even have a sense that there's anything beyond it. There's sort of those narratives that are just so tight, that elegant novel, that they betray a kind of self-satisfaction that everything's been thought of. There is no mystery, there's no openness, there's no chance for anything else. And I think that sort of slightly smug novel that is also cynical, sounding awful like Houellebecq, to be honest, but I won't say that outright.